All right. There's a lot of productive and a lot of non-productive work that has gone on in the MPLS work group. And the IESG they estimated 200 to 300 drafts related to MPLS. And obviously, there's a lot of non-productive work in that many drafts. In order to try to bring some sanity back to that whole process, they decided to break up the MPLS work group and some work related to it into and form a new sub-area or a new area, and it's a temporary area called the the sub-IP area. Okay. Thought I knew how to drive this. Works great. Okay. They started out with 6 work groups, and they somehow ended up with 6 work groups and a BOF. And I've been told that PWE3, which is private wire emulation edge-to-edge, may actually end up in some other area. Right now they have the original MPLS work group in the sub-area. This is all on the IETF web page, so it's somewhat of a repeat of that. The IP over optical, which was a work group for quite a while now, they've created a new work group called CCAMP, and that's Common Control and Measurement Plane. The way the IESG sees this is that CCAMP is common control for MPLS and for other technologies. The way some of the people in the MPLS community see this is that CCAMP is MPLS. It's the GMPLS, Generalized MPLS. So there seems to be some difference of opinion in that area. There are a number of new work groups, provider provision virtual networks, IP over packet rings. That one just kind of appeared out of nowhere as far as I'm concerned, but it wasn't mentioned at all at the last IETF meeting, and just sort of appeared on the IETF web page as far as I could see. The traffic engineering work group is, of course, a place in which providers can give requirements, and I'm going to talk about each work group a little bit. The Generalized switch management protocol is something that Nortel has done, and as far as I know, none of the major, well, I shouldn't say major, but none of the core switch vendors, meaning vendors who have OC192 interfaces or at least OC48 interfaces on their routers, are doing GSMT. However, it's got its own work group, and it seems to be progressing. The IP over packet rings, over resilient packet rings, the idea was presented at the last IETF, and my recollection was that it was pretty soundly rejected. But apparently they formed a work group. However, the work group seems to only be putting together a framework document to be used as input to the IEEE. What I have been told is that the IESG just wants to provide input to the IEEE so that the IEEE doesn't try to help IP too much, as they may have done in some of the 802.3p stuff. The provider provision virtual private networks, again, is not doing any protocol work. They're actually looking at the existing, there's an abundance of VPN proposals, more than we need. So the PPVPN is supposed to come up with a framework, a set of requirements, and then take a look at the existing VPN proposals against the set of requirements. I'm not sure what the next step is beyond that. For quite a while, there's been a push to create a VPN work group and decide on the one VPN strategy, but I'm not sure that that's going to converge, and this may just document the many VPN strategies. IP over optical has been a very interesting work group. It's been around for a little while, and there's a lot of interest, of course, in WDM, in optical switching. There's the optical community at one point, or at least some of the vendors, had been claiming that this optics stuff is really hard and you router vendors could never possibly understand it. Some people have tried to quantify that. There are problems with, if you're doing transparent optical switching, there are problems with dispersion, and there's problems with attenuation that you don't get in a regular packet switch network. Some of these impairments are not linear. That's been a big. That's come to the surface as what they're talking about. The idea that you would build a network and only use one optical switch vendor has been pretty soundly rejected by the customers of those optical switch vendors, and so they're starting to think about interoperability. At one point, there was a notion that there would be a UNI, and that what happened inside the optical network was nobody's business except the vendor. That position is softening. The IPO work group is now coming up with requirements that are unique to optical. One of the differences between optical and a packet switch network is that you have a quantization of bandwidth. You either get 1 times whatever OC48 or OC192, or 2 times. You can't get 1.5 OC48s on an optical network, unless it's also doing TDM. As this work group stands, it doesn't do any protocol design. It just comes up with requirements. There is a provision in there, and it's suggested that with a change to the charter, and they're not ruling it out completely, so they're saying with a change to the charter that they could go ahead and do protocol work. One of the areas in which there's been a lot of, there's very diverse opinion on whether the OIF UNI is of any use. There are providers who, there has been interest in that area, put it that way. In fact, we just did a press release on it, so I guess we're kind of interested too. But the problems with the UNI are kind of well known. The ATM UNI is essentially unused. Nobody really does SVCs. For some reason, there are providers that think that this is going to be useful, and the optical switch vendors think that this is going to be useful. And there are others who don't feel it's useful. So far, the OIF UNI has, or a UNI has not become an official work group document in any work group in the IETF. And my personal opinion is that there are enough people that don't want anything to do with this, both because OIF is doing it, and let them, if they want to do it, let them do it, and because there are a number of people who don't feel it's going to be useful. Opinions, of course, do vary. CCAMP. In theory, CCAMP sits above Mpls, and it also sits above ATM and frame relay and TDM and everything else. There are others who actually don't believe that theory, that they believe that Mpls and CCAMP are one and the same, and that GMPLS is really CCAMP. The reality seems to be that there's only one draft right now within the work group, and it's related to GMPLS. It's actually GMPLS extensions for SONET and SDH. And there is a possibility that the only drafts that will end up in this work group are GS-MPLS over X, where X might be optical or sonnet, TDM. There's a different TDM for optical rather than the sonnet TDM. Okay. Most of the discussion on the mailing list has been regarding GMPLS. There was some discussion of Ron Bonica's tunnel trace draft. I don't know, how many people here have that do MPLS have the ICMP turned on? How many people do MPLS? How many people know what MPLS is? Okay. Anyway, the IESG for some reason doesn't like the MPLS ICMP draft, and the tunnel trace is supposed to be more general, no layer violations, whatever. The GMPLS work continues, though, to be mostly in the MPLS work group, and one of the areas that CCAMP is supposed to take over is restoration. All the restoration mechanisms, at least that I know of, have been proposed strictly for MPLS, where MPLS sits on top of TDM or it sits on top of an optical network. So again, it doesn't match the reality doesn't seem to match the IETF view. I mean the IESG view of certain IESG members, anyway. The MPLS work group had been the place where all the useful work was going on, and it has been a very productive work group from the standpoint that there are quite a number of RFCs now out of the work group. There's an enormous list of Internet drafts that are work group drafts. They don't necessarily match the charter, but part of that has been because over the last year, the IESG has been shuffling work groups around, and everybody's just been submitting their drafts to the MPLS work group until the whole thing settled down. There's been a lot of interoperability testing, and there's been some deployment, so I would have to say that that's a productive work group. Okay. This is a list of the Internet drafts that are currently up there. The MPLS carrying label information over BGP is up for last call. The GMPLS set is up for last call. The RSVP LSP tunnels work is in the RFC editor's hands, and I believe that should come out pretty soon. I guess that's number 4 on the list. All the LDP stuff, I believe, has already gone RFC. Well, not all the LDP. There's what's known as the LDP box set. Actually, that's on the next slide, which is 4 drafts that have just gone to RFC. So quite a number of the drafts on this list are either in the IESG's hands or in the RFC editor's hands. There is nothing on here as a work group item, although there are a number of drafts. Don't know if George Swallow's bypass is on this list. I don't see it. I don't think that one's on this list. The Juniper's fast reroute proposal, again for local protection, is not on here. One of the perceived needs for MPLS, other than traffic engineering, is quick restoration, and where to do that has bounced around. What work group to do that in? It's currently thought to be CCAMP. So all the drafts are still individual submissions, and probably the rule that will prevail is those with implementations will survive. Okay, this is a list of the RFCs that are available. As I mentioned, the LDP box set is LDP specification, applicability, and I thought the loop prevention. These have all gone to RFC. The TE stuff is lagging because it's still in the RFC editor's hands. So there should be another short list. At least 2 more documents should come out quickly. Right now, there's a joint last call in MPLS and CCAMP for the generalized MPLS work. Now, the generalized MPLS work is essentially MPLS used to control TDM and optical switches. The idea behind this is that you can set up hierarchical tunnels where your tunnels can pass through multiple technologies. It can pass through a regular packet switch network if you want to set up, for example, a tunnel at 500 megabits, and part of it is going to go over a OC48 capable optical network with no TDM. The setup of that 500 megabit tunnel would cause the setup of a 2.5 gigabit tunnel, which then could be reused. Other ingresses would be aware that that had been set up and could take advantage of it, and prefer paths for which there was already a path through the optical network, as opposed to creating a new one. This is a way of providing a dynamic signaling on the optical network. If you prefer the overlay model, then neither the UNI or GMPLS is necessary. GMPLS also can be run over various TDM technologies. There's a lot of interest in TDM over optical burst switching, which is essentially a TDM technology over an optical network in which very large bursts are sent over the optical network, providing a sort of a coarse TDM capability. That means that you don't have to set up a full OC48 or OC192 from point A to point B. You can set up a fraction of an OC48 or an OC192. That is technology that's really not there yet. In other words, there are no implementations yet. Okay. The workgroup that's probably of most interest to NANOG, other than the fact that there are people who both go to IETF and to NANOG, is the traffic engineering workgroup. And there's 2 methods that have been used for filtering. One may be unintentional, and that is that by shuffling these internet drafts among workgroups and sort of creating a bureaucratic headache, many of the internet draft authors who sort of just send something off to the internet drafts editor have sort of given up, and a lot of the junk drafts have gone away. The other way in which the other filtering process is that there's a strong push now for requirements to come out of the TE workgroup before work goes on in other IETF workgroups. CCAMP and MPLS, for example, right now TE workgroup needs to come up with requirements for restoration before the CCAMP workgroup starts to accept documents as workgroup items. If there is no requirement for restoration, in other words, if nobody steps forward and says they really need this, then no work would go on. There's a number of areas such as end-to-end security across MPLS tunnels. In other words, if you're trying to create an MPLS tunnel across a non-trusted set of LSRs, there was an internet draft to accomplish that. There was no perceived use for it. No provider was willing to step forward and say they needed that, and so that gave basically the IETF as a community, the work groups in that case, the chairs, the work group itself the means to say no. We don't want to proceed with that work. So since the traffic engineering work group is taking requirements, they prefer that providers participate in the TE work group. They don't want the equipment vendors to go and tell them what their products do and then say, that's a requirement, because they feel that they'll tend to get bias towards existing product, regardless of whether it's useful. Okay. This is some excerpts from the charter of the traffic engineering work group. They're supposed to be putting together BCPs, the operational TE MIB, which is essentially the Juniper traffic engineering MIB, with some modifications to make sure that it's thoroughly broken and not useful anymore. Unfortunately, the SNMP purists got at it, and it got modified, and the MIB that's out there doesn't even compile. The TE interoperability and information and implementation informational notes, TE. GMU Jabari over at BMU, Dr. Bijan Jabari, has agreed to try to put this together along with the other people who have participated in the interoperability tests at GMU. However, last I heard from him, he was going to check with everybody that participated in the interoperability test and get their okay, and that was the end of it. I guess he didn't get everybody's okay, or he's still checking. The applicability statement was V.J. Gill's work, and his famous quote is, in order to need traffic engineering, you need traffic. Okay. So where is the sub-area headed? The Mpls work group was headed in every direction all at once, and the sub-area was supposed to take care of the chaos, was supposed to help sort out the chaos, and I think it is actually helping. It has helped weed out the contributions, the quote contributions, some of which were junk drafts, or I might note that the IPO work group probably holds all records for the number of framework documents proposed by a single work group. So the IETF is really looking for requirements so that they actually implement things that are useful, which is kind of a nice thing for them to do. One of the routing area has an additional requirement that is not a requirement of general internet drafts, and that is that there be two interoperable implementations. And my personal opinion is that the IP sub-area should also have that requirement, and I've expressed that to a couple of IESG members. The idea is to get things that people have actually implemented, as opposed to ideas that people have proposed and not really sure if they're going to implement it or not. And well, that's basically it.